Should I just begin?
Yeah, the stage is yours.
All right, so my talk is entitled Sagacity and Silicon. I'm coming at this from a cognitive science perspective. That's my area of expertise. So the first point I want to discuss is that decades of rigorous and well-replicated experimentation by Stanovich and a host of other people provided strong evidence for the following claim. Intelligence, especially what I'll talk about in a bit as general intelligence, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being rational. Basically, we can do measures of general intelligence. I'm not entering into the debate of whether or not that constitutes all of intelligence, but it certainly is, I believe, a real thing. And we have ways of measuring how well people do, for example, in reasoning tests and other measures of rationality. And what we find is that the tests for intelligence all form a strong positive manifold. They all strongly mutually predict each other. So how you do in one of these tests strongly predicts on how you do on all the others. And we find the same thing for the tests of rationality. How you do on any one of these tests strongly predicts on how you do all the others. So you have two manifolds, and then you can just ask the question, how strongly are they correlated with each other? And on average, they correlate with around 0.3, which is important, but far from parity or far from approaching parity. So the evidence shows overwhelmingly that you can be highly intelligent and highly irrational because intelligence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for rationality. So what do we mean by intelligence in this context? And what are people seeking in the new revolution in AI, which is called AGI, the pursuit of artificial general intelligence? So what's rationality? Rationality is dealing with the inevitable self-deception, bias, prejudice, misapprehension, misframing of problem, etc., arises in any finite intelligent cognitive agent. So you use your general intelligence to solve your problems, and your rationality addresses the meta problem of the self-deception that inevitably arises as you exercise your general intelligence. And there's both in journals and online in videos. At the core of intelligence is an ability I call relevance realization. This is, can be quickly explained to you. The amount of information I can consider in the world is combinatorially explosive, astronomically vast. The amount of information I can consult in my long-term memory, including all the ways and permutations of how I could combine it, is combinatorially explosive. All the courses of action I could consider to undertake, all the sequences of behavior, moving this finger, then this finger, saying one word, moving this, etc., is combinatorially explosive. And nevertheless, this is what we do very readily. We zero in on the relevant information. We pay attention to the right thing, we remember the right things, and we engage in the appropriate actions. We do it far from perfectly for a reason I'm going to mention in a second, but we do it reliably enough that we are general problem solvers. Now, the problem with this relevance realization process is it works in terms of two core abilities. One is the ability, and this almost sounds like a Zen koan, to ignore most of the information. So you actually become intelligent by a capacity to ignore most information. You don't check it, determine that it's irrelevant, and then move on, because that would be combinatorially explosive. Even our best AI doesn't attempt to do anything like that. The second thing, and this helps deal with a lot of deeper problems about understanding and meaning, is, and Reid Montague put this out in his book, Your Brain is Almost Perfect, that unlike a computer, you care about some information rather than other information. So there's both this intelligent ignorance and this capacity to care, which is your capacity to commit your precious metabolic, cognitive, and temporal resources. So true intelligence is never cold calculation. It is always affectively latent. So we note now the central role of both attention, in which things are made salient to us. Presumably I'm salient to you right now, and your left big toe is not, although now it may be that because I just said that, and affect. because you're committing your precious resources, there has to be some affect. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's something maybe some pleasure, or maybe you don't like what I'm saying, there's anger, but there's a way in which affect is always helping you hone in on what information you should pay attention to and how much you should invest yourself in it. I do think what's happening as we move towards AGI is the recognition that we have to give AI these sophisticated attentional and affective components. Now, inevitably, and this is why you can't be perfect, inevitably you find the wrong information and you overcommit or undercommit your resources. And so you don't properly ratio, you don't properly ration. I'm using rationality in a more comprehensive and ancient sense. You don't properly ration your attention and your affect to the situation at hand in a way that is appropriate for serving your goals, both your short-term and your long-term goals. So what does that mean? That means that you have to develop separate abilities that help you break out of when you have misframed problems, when you have misapprehended situations. And of course, we're seeing that while the AI is probably appreciably faster than us in doing all kinds of information processing, most of the errors, even in really sophisticated programs, are these errors of misapprehension, misframing, etc. They're failures of relevance realization. So this is what we're going to see is more and more effort put into addressing this problem. However, as I noted, simply giving a machine the capacity for intelligence, relevance realization is insufficient. You need to give it this second order reflective ability to correct itself, to have something something similar to insight when you realize that you have misapprehended, misframed a situation, and to guard certain kinds of information processing from being overly distorted by the tendencies to misapprehension and misframing. We cannot permanently remove this, but we can ameliorate it, and that's what we do with our rationality. We do not shut off our intelligence. That would be disaster. We ameliorate it. So here's the point now. Making AGI, making artificial general intelligence, without making it artificially rational, will be to create highly intelligent but highly irrational entities. And I think this is clearly morally wrong, not just for us, and this is my point, but for the machines we are making, to create beings that would be highly intelligent and highly irrational. And we perhaps know individuals that fit that bill. They typically do not lead lives that they themselves find to be filled with eudaimonia. So I think creating artificial intelligence without putting an equal effort into artificial rationality is morally wrong and obviously pragmatically dangerous. We don't want a lot of highly intelligent but significantly self-deceptive machines running around. And what I would put it to you is the effort going into artificial rationality pales significantly in comparison to the effort going into artificial intelligence through things like deep learning. Now, I have another argument I won't make, but I'll refer to. I actually gave this argument at Cambridge in February, based on some papers I've recently published with Dan Chiappi, that we do not, and this is something coming out of what's called 4E cognitive science, we do not have just one kind of knowing. We do not just have our beliefs about propositions. We have procedural knowing. We know how to do things, how to exercise skills. We have perspectival knowing. We know what it's like to be in this state of mind, in this situation. We have ways in which we know by assuming certain identities and assigning certain identities. I'm a lecturer, you're an audience, etc. And what that indicates is that the kind of rationality we're talking about goes beyond inferential rationality. It has us giving us the capacities to engage in the requisite self-correction for our skills, our states of mind, and our traits of character. And of course, that brings us back to the ancient notion of virtue. That I take it that one of the things that virtue did was integrate our inferential abilities, our skills, our states of mind, and our traits of character in a in a rational manner, but the notion of rationality here exceeds so sort of standard Cartesian notion of rationality as the inferential manipulation of propositions. The virtue that we would most need, of course, is the meta virtue of wisdom. So as intelligence is insufficient for rationality, one kind of rationality is insufficient for wisdom. So recently I was able to partake in a wisdom consensus paper published in 2019. Most of the researchers, international researchers in science, in cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy were getting together to discuss, try to come up with a consensus understanding of wisdom. One of the central features, if not the central feature of wisdom, is a kind of meta-perspectival virtue, the ability to virtuously move between different perspectives and consider them and judge their relevance and pertinence. And of course, simply making a machine more capable of inferential rationality does not give it this ability. So in making AGI, we will make machines that are highly intelligent but irrational, and if they lack wisdom, they will be foolish. They will be self-deceptive in a vicious manner. I think making entities like this is highly immoral. I think I could make the argument, but I think most of you can make the argument for yourself intuitively. Making these kinds of entities is immoral, not just to us, but to them. This would be analogous to being an extremely bad parent. And since we very rarely take that to be a significant immoral act, I think we would be doing something at least analogous to that, but much worse. Of course, making very intelligent, highly irrational, and highly foolish entities, I think, is also significantly dangerous. Now, notice this is not the typical danger represented in the media of cold, calculating, logic machines, et cetera, et cetera. No, these machines, I would argue, are plausibly going to have a lot of what we consider human traits of affect, the direction of attention, et cetera, the ability to zero in on relevant information in context. But what I'm trying to argue is just giving that raw ability, just giving them intelligence is insufficient for rationality, and even more so insufficient for wisdom. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, what that means for us is we have been able to use ourselves as the template for AGI. That has been the standard always and continues to be so. And I put it to you that we need to become the standard for rationality and wisdom if we are going to avoid the dangerous immorality of creating highly intelligent, highly irrational, highly foolish entities. There's a moral obligation on us that now goes beyond the standing moral obligation which we inherited from antiquity to cultivate rationality and wisdom. There's now an urgent moral imperative added to us to become more individually and collectively rational and wise. Because if we do not have the templates, we do not know how we are going to make progress on making these machines more rational and more wise. Now, I think this whole process is even more imperative because of an intervening stage that I think is on the horizon. So Andy Clark famously wrote that we are naturally born cyborgs. Other than the atmosphere and my naked body, everything around me is a tool and I am cyborg to it. The technology, and this of course is a Heideggerian point, has become so transparent to us and so interwoven with our identity and our agency that we do not see it. We are already cyborging ourselves into AI. I think it's plausible that this will come sooner than the success of AGI itself. Why? Because one of the things we've been discovering about computer-brain interface is we don't have to have everything running on the computer side. What has been found, somewhat surprising from one viewpoint, but not from another, is the brain helps in this process. When you try to create human-computer interface direct brain linkage, the brain actually redesigns itself through plasticity, both synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, and forms of exaptation to accommodate the technology. And you can see this even in primates, in which the brain image, for example, the brain processing that handles the body image of a macaque will change if the macaque is regularly using a tool to incorporate the tool into its identity. This goes back, it's ancient, it's part of our deep adaptivity. I think the temptation will be overwhelming that we will cyborg ourselves. And therefore, we have the possibility of not only on the machine side, creating highly irrational and foolish beings that are nevertheless more intelligent. We have the capacity to, by integrating ourselves with said machines, exacerbate our own proclivities to irrational and foolish behavior. The fact that these aspects of rationality, virtue, and wisdom are not being considered as central to this experiment we are running on ourselves, and in terms of a new kind of cognitive agent we might be giving birth to, is not driven by any good consideration of the science. The science is there. We have decades of the most mainstream, well-replicated, robust experimental evidence about the relationships between intelligence and rationality. There's an emerging consensus science around wisdom. So it's not for a lack of science that this is not happening. One has to ask, what is it about the current situation that makes us marginalize and background the pursuit of artificial rationality and artificial wisdom? And I'm trying to suggest to you, this has nothing to do with the preponderance of the available science and cutting edge theoretical reflection. I would put it to you that it has to do with certain cultural imperatives, certain deep structures in our cultural cognitive grammar of how we think about intelligence, how we think about rationality, and how we think about wisdom that is actually preventing us to properly proportion our efforts to artificial rationality and artificial wisdom. Now, a lot of this has been pointing out very negative. I want to throw one more thing out that perhaps adds a wrench to things. If we do succeed in these moral challenges, and we make ourselves requisitely rational and wise, and we make the machines similarly rational, virtuous, and wise, I think the morality of the thing flips. And this is probably something that's a little bit difficult to hear. If we meet those moral challenges, we will be making silicon sages, hence my title, Sagacity and Silicon. And I put this now to you as an open question. Is there any moral argument against making such silicon sages? They may replace us. So what? Presumably they are wiser and virtuous and leading better lives than we are. In fact, might we not be morally obligated to try to endeavor to bring about such silicon sages? So in addition to the moral obligation of making these machines and making ourselves more rational and wise, we might have an otherwise implicit moral obligation, which I'm now making explicit, to undertake the creation of silicon sages, because presumably bringing such beings of inherent value into existence is something that we should do. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
I would like to ask a question right away. I had to think, when you talked about sages, I had to think of the movie The Matrix. I'm going to just assume most people, they've seen The Matrix, and I had to think of the fact that in the matrix you get figures such as the oracle. You get figures that are not necessarily running a script, but they're kind of by design, by
Recording
origin.
stopped.
By their origin, they're kind of these figures that are meant to display wisdom, give advice, while still being embedded in the network. Is that kind of sci-fi depiction something that goes in the direction of what you were thinking of?
Yes, I think it goes towards that. And I want to point out that the Oracle, of course, notice her status. The fact that she's the Oracle, she's given a divine status, and she forms she basically has a kind of moral authority over the human beings. Even Morpheus follows her, for example. And that moral authority is not completely transparent to the human beings. They don't quite understand how she does what she does and why she has the wisdom she does. They seems to be just favorably towards them. And presumably Silicon sages would be well disposed towards us for the same more reasons why we should be well disposed towards chimpanzees and dogs. And if that sounds insulting to your ear, I don't know what to do about that, because we're considering the possibility of agency that is in some well-argued fashion morally and epistemically superior to us. And that's what's portrayed in the Oracle. And so my question would be, if we could make such a being, and we have to, I argue, satisfy the other two moral problems I've addressed, if we could, shouldn't we make such a being? So there's a third moral imperative that emerges after you satisfy the first two that I mentioned.
Interesting. Thank you. I think I've seen a question in the chat. Is that right?
Do you want me to read the question, or are you going to read it out?
Just a sec. Can you scroll down there? Yeah, when you say use us as a standard for AGI, would that not mean limiting a new form of intelligence? I mean, if we create a new form of intelligence, would it not be wise to think out of the box and not only take our intelligence as a gold standard?
So the problem with that is, by definition, that does not exist for us. So how we would use that as a standard is unclear. The idea that we could sort of make something and it could have an intelligence be beyond what we understand to be intelligence, that's sort of a Hollywood thing. Usually there's some sort of deus ex machina that involves some accident happens, et cetera, et cetera. Think about the difficulties of what's being proposed. We don't have such a standard, and so we can't bring it to bear. So we don't know if we're moving closer to it or farther away. We get into a deep Meno's paradox. How would we recognize the machine as having it if we don't know at all what it is? I think they're locked into us as the template. Now, I'm talking about time. Right? Now, of course, these machines could be faster than us in terms of their intelligence. They may be able to process more information, but they would still have to be, I would argue, relevance realizing entities. And this is because of some very deep mathematical and computational constraints on being a general problem solver, which are coming to the fore, by the way, in the project of AGI.
Thank you, John. We will move on to our next speaker. I'm very, very thankful for you to join us, to have joined us today. And anyone who's interested in John's work, he has a very interesting podcast called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and also does many different interesting dialogues with various other people.